Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I know from your presence that you are committed to our topic today, media freedom, because you were required to be here at such an ungodly hour, and my apologies for that. It is great to see so many ministers, journalists, civil society members here today, including many familiar faces. I should explain that the Foreign Secretary of the UK, for reasons that you may surmise, had to go back to London. But I'm delighted to say that Lord Ahmed, the Minister of State for the Commonwealth and the United Nations, is here with us and will be addressing you all in a little while. And actually, can I start by inviting Lord Ahmed to introduce the panel, and then we'll hear from each of the speakers in turn. There will be time for questions and answers over the last half hour of our session today.
Thank you, Amal, and Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my immense pleasure to be here and delighted to be joined by Amal Clooney, who's the Special Envoy for the UK on the issue and the important issue of media freedom. And in the time since the conference, in the lead up to the conference that we held over the summer in London, I pay tribute to how she's worked tirelessly on this primary objective and priority for the UK government. At this time, I'd also, and I'm truly delighted to welcome on the panel this morning, His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Sudan, who really epitomizes how change can happen very quickly. Just before we came in, I remember visiting Khartoum not so long ago, and what we've seen happen on the ground so rapidly is a tribute to how civilian rule can be instigated, and I'm sure we're very much looking forward to his contribution this morning. Thanks to the efforts of his government, for the first time in 3 decades, Sudan's journalists will be free to report without fear or favour. I'm also delighted that we welcome the UNESCO Director-General here this morning as well, and she is representing also, of course, the Secretary-General in her capacity this morning. And finally, to my right is journalist Jason Rezian. Many of you know Jason. I've said to him, it's the first occasion we've had to meet, but I know about him, I've heard about him, and many of you will recall that he was imprisoned for 544 days in Iran, and he'll be speaking about his insights and experience as well. From our perspective, I'm proud to come from a country that's been a beacon of free speech for more than 4 centuries, from the abolition of the Licensing Act, which set free the printing presses of the 17th century, to the invention of television, which changed the landscape of how we receive news. It's the home of George Orwell, whose caustic criticism of Newspeak and the thought police shone a light on the chilling totalitarian efforts to silence the press. And it is the home of William Russell, who became the first modern war correspondent when he brought the bloody battles of the Crimean War to British broadsheets, shocking a nation with his description of, famously quoted, the thin, thin red line. We have much to be proud of in our rich tradition of media freedom, and yes, like many countries, we are grappling with the balance between free speech, national security, and privacy. But those are tough questions we are willing to ask of ourselves, because ultimately a free media is essential to any flourishing democracy. It is the bedrock on which all other freedoms are based and indeed preserved. As Thomas Jefferson poignantly wrote, the liberty of speaking and writing guards our other liberties. We're gathered here this morning because as member states of the United Nations, we have all long recognized the importance of media freedom in building more just, peaceful, and prosperous societies, as reflected in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We need it to ensure free and open debate. We need it to promote discussion and the exchange of ideas, technological and economic ideas, as well as political ones. We also need it to root out corruption, hold governments to account. We need it to inform and engage people around the world on the issues that matter most to them in their day-to-day lives. Today, that freedom is under threat. Freedom House reported this year that freedom, and I quote from the report, freedom of the media has been deteriorating around the world over the past decade. Indeed, that is true even in the most influential democracies of the world. In their pursuit of the truth, just for simply doing their jobs, journalists, often in the front line, have become targets of censorship and intimidation. And too many, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, have paid the ultimate price. We are approaching the anniversaries of the tragic deaths of journalists Martin O'Hagan, Jamal Khashoggi, and Daphne Caruana Galizia. While the world continues to express its outrage at these and other murders, the violence hasn't stopped. Just this year, and I'm sure we'll hear from UNESCO as well, UNESCO itself reports that 41 journalists and media workers have been killed. According to Reporters Without Borders, 383 journalists and media workers are imprisoned in countries such as Turkey, China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Eritrea. We must remember that journalists like Javed Nouri, a citizen journalist who was executed by the Taliban in Afghanistan, or the Venezuelan journalist Luis Carlos Diaz, who was arrested, charged with public incitement linked to the nationwide extended blackout in March and banned from leaving the country. Or Huang Qi, himself a human rights reporter who was sentenced to 12 years in a Chinese prison in a flagrant violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This tide of oppression against free media across the world harms the countries affected and offends others against the values we hold so dear. So we all have a moral imperative to stop the threat to media freedom, whether it's violence, unduly restrictive laws and regulations, imprisonment, detention, or indeed internet censorship. Last year, the United Kingdom launched a campaign to shine a global spotlight on this crucial issue. And in this summer, the then Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, Canadian Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, used the convening power of the UK and Canada to bring together 1,500 representatives from over 100 countries to the world's first global conference for media freedom in London. I know many of them in this room were there, and both Amal and I were delighted to be part of that landmark event. Together with our Canadian friends, we asked ministers, leaders in civil society, academics, and of course the media themselves, what are the challenges facing journalists and the media? How can we galvanize support in holding the powerful to account? It is clear there are some countries who are unable to protect media freedom, and there are others who are simply unwilling to do so. First takes those unable to protect media freedom. We know that creating legislative protections in domestic law, and I'm sure that will come up in our discussions this morning, provides the foundations for media freedom. So we are encouraging countries around the world to sign the campaign's global pledge and to live up to the commitments within it. Today, I'm proud to announce that I believe the 30 governments have signed the global pledge, and in doing so, we have become founding members of the new Media Freedom Coalition. For each signatory, being part of this coalition means that laws within our own countries will be held to the highest of standards. But some countries need technical support to turn their ideals into legal protections. So we are delighted to support the independent high-level panel of legal experts, which has been convened by Amal, to advise countries on how to strengthen their legal protection of journalists, whether it's advising governments on new international commitments or indeed assisting with repeal of outdated or restrictive legislation. All members must also ensure that their country frameworks are up to task. And of course, the United Kingdom is no exception. So we are taking steps to establish a national committee on the safety of journalists, tasked with developing a national action plan to ensure that those who threaten journalists are held to account. And a new dedicated international task force led by UNESCO will assist governments around the world in developing their own plans tailored to the needs of their own legal systems. Next, we must protect journalists and help them avail themselves of these legal resources. With that in mind, the second prong of our approach is helping journalists enforce those legal protections. The Global Media Defence Fund, administered by UNESCO, will support, train, and indeed provide legal support and advocacy for journalists in the most dangerous scenarios, whether it's covering the Taliban on the battlefields of Afghanistan or cartel violence in Mexico. The UK government has already pledged £3 million worth of support for this new fund, and I strongly encourage those gathered here today to consider making a commitment and contribution too. And the third part of our strategic approach, we will act as the advocacy group to lobby those who are not just unable, but also importantly unwilling to sign up to the commitments currently in the Global Pledge. And we will raise our voices on behalf of journalists who have been imprisoned or indeed tragically murdered. Ultimately, we need every country to recognize that attacks on media freedom are frankly beyond the pale. And just like any assault on human rights, and I speak as the UK Human Rights Minister, we must hold abusers accountable, both legally and financially. We want to make sure that no profit comes from serious human rights violations or abuses anywhere in the world. So when we leave the European Union, we will be introducing a UK Magnitsky Law. This will allow the United Kingdom to impose sanctions in the form of barring entry and freezing assets against anyone who is responsible for the most serious human rights violations or abuses. And yes, that includes against journalists or whistleblowers. And we won't give up the fight for justice on behalf of those who have been suffered or been killed. More than 2 years have passed since the death of the young freelance journalist Christopher Allen in South Sudan. But sadly, no investigation has taken place into this murder. We are redoubling our efforts to ensure justice for Christopher and for his family. Many remain in prison, such as Eric Kabendera in Tanzania. Others, such as Maria Reza from the Philippines, here with us today, live under the threat of prosecution. In every case, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in every case, and on behalf of every journalist and indeed every family, we will continue to press for justice and accountability, to keep the flame of media freedom burning in some of the darkest corners of the world, where the work of reporters is so very, very important. In concluding, I am touched by, and I'm sure many of us recount, in a speech before she was killed, of the renowned Sunday Times war correspondent, Marie Colvin, once described her work as sending home that first rough draft of history. She died doing just that. But with each abuse of power against media, those drafts of history and the reporters who bear witness to them risk being lost. Our mission, simply put, is to secure those basic freedoms for the media around the world. But I fully accept it is not an easy task. It won't be accomplished by the will of the few. It will take the absolute commitment and resolve of the many. We hope we can count on your support, because those who ultimately put their lives on the line every day in pursuit of the truth deserve no less. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Ahmed. I'd now like to invite His Excellency Dr. Abdallah Hamdok, Prime Minister of Sudan, to address you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everybody. Distinguished panel members, distinguished delegates, participants, media representatives here present. It is indeed an honor and a great pleasure to be with you this morning and to address you on this important topic on media freedom. This would never have been possible a few months back. Thanks to the Sudanese people who made this possible, but thanks also to our friends all over the world who stood with us. Starting, I would like to appreciate and commend the role of the UK and Canada for initiating the global campaign to champion media freedom. I would never have thought of a better place or forum in introducing the new Sudan than this. The struggle of the Sudanese people is essentially struggle for democracy and freedom. It has been a peaceful revolution that lasted for over 3-4 months, and every time we thought it's dying down, it surprised us with its resolve, determination, and resilience until we got rid of the dictatorship. Our revolution slogan is freedom, peace, and justice, and we strive to exactly implement that. We came from very far. We have inherited an ugly legacy of repression, jailing of journalists, confiscation of newspapers, all forms of censorship. Most of the papers, if not all of them, are owned by the state with its repressive nature. That is also true to visual or other forms of media. Extremely repressive environment. And you can imagine how journalists will live under that. we share Lord Ahmed understanding of the role of the press in the freedom. Free press is a pillar in promoting democracy, good governance, and human rights. These are very real commodities in my country over the last 30 years. Free press help promoting a culture of tolerance, dialogue, establishing solid foundations of mediating differences through dialogue, rather than resorting to other means of repression. But most importantly, promote a culture of peace. It is something that we in Sudan, in the transitional government, we have it as our #1 priority. Have wars in all corners of our countries. Wars in Darfur, for those who know the country, in South Kordofan, the Blue Nile, the East. So a free media and press can contribute a lot in promoting that culture. Free media promote transparency, accountability, but also help us root out corruption and all malpractices by making information available to the public and create an environment where the populace are the guardian of everything we do in the country, put government under check, and truly represent the force power in a democratic dispensation. And we look forward to creating exactly that. Historically, we used to have this. We lost it for 30 years, but I think it's coming back. We know it's not easy, it's challenging. Of course, even in established democracies, there are challenges of media freedom. But we are determined to move in this direction, and with the support of friends and partners, we will be able to do that. We are putting in place very ambitious plans to support media freedom. We have the honor to announce to you that we have signed the Global Pledge for Media Freedom, and we look forward to be an active member of this campaign. We take it very serious, and I'm glad to hear today that we will be one of the founding members of this campaign. Of course, you cannot imagine how excited we are by being part of this club, something that I've never dreamed of maybe just few months back. So thank you very much for this. We are working on repealing all the repressive laws and on press freedom. We are putting a lot of legislations, changing leadership of our TV channels, of broadcasting stations and all that, and creating a true environment where media can flourish and play its rightful role in helping building the nation and bringing us from the ashes. We are also reforming our institutions to accompany this change. You can imagine what a repressive police force, an independent and a totally dependent judicial system could create. We are working on that, and we are serious about having a judiciary system that is totally independent of any interference from politics, from executive, from all that. Historically, we had that, and we are going to restore it. It's a long journey, but I think we are putting our foot in the right direction. Police force has always been a force that is accustomed and used to jailing, of detaining, of crushing demonstrations and all that. In a new Sudan, we will not allow this. People are free to demonstrate in an orderly fashion, of course, and all that, but this will be the new environment. And finally, I can assure you, never again in the new Sudan, journalists will be repressed or oppressed or jailed. I can assure you of that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to an interactive process where we could listen to your views, comments, responses, questions, and thank you for inviting me for this very important and exciting side event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm sure I speak for everybody here today when I say that we are all supporting you at a time of great hope for Sudan. You know, I know many of us watched those images of the protesters, so courageous, led by so many young people, so many women, and it was really amazing to see somebody, as I was watching, somebody reminded me of the phrase, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. And it's really what comes to mind when you watch people like that. So we wish you the best. We are here to offer any support in your important transition towards democracy and freedom. And we're really happy to hear what you have in mind. You know, we always hear the first thing a dictator does when they come to power is muzzle and silence the press. So it's great to hear that when a state is actually transitioning the other way, the first thing they want to do is free the press, and that makes sense. So great to hear your remarks. I'd now like to invite Audrey Azoulay, the Director-General of UNESCO, to speak.
Thank you. Distinguished panel members, distinguished ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, it's a great pleasure, honor, to be with you at the invitation of the United Kingdom, at the heart of multilateralism. I'd say it's also our duty, our mission, that echoes the United Nations values, and particularly UNESCO's constitution. We're proud to share with the UK this priority on media freedom, and I want to thank all of you who are here today, and some of you we work with all year long on this issue. We work very well with the UK on this priority as we work together on another priority dear to our heart, which is girls' and women's education. You mentioned some numbers, dear Lord Ahmad. Maybe one more. Since the last time we met at the Global Conference for Media Freedom that took place in London this summer, 13 journalists have died doing their jobs, 13 in less than 3 months. And of course, this figure cannot summarize the full extent of the threats that are holding media freedom hostage. Murder is not the only danger faced. Journalists all over the world, and especially women, are physically attacked, risk imprisonment or are jailed, are intimidated or receive threats and harassment. And as you know, impunity is the rule in more than 90% of the cases. So not only there is no media freedom, but there is no justice. There is also another factor at play, which is everywhere, and in democracy as well, the seeds of doubt that are being sown about journalism as a profession and as a public good for democracy, which ultimately impacts citizen capacity for critical thinking. According to Reporters Without Borders, cher Christophe, just 10% of the world population has access to genuinely free press in their country today. It is very important that this event takes place within the UN General Assembly, as it has to be, as it needs strong engagement, commitment of the international community. This is, as you know, the spirit of the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity, which is coordinated by UNESCO, but implemented with the UN network at large, and in particular with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we contribute with you at UNESCO to this UN plan by first monitoring and issuing warning on the situation of journalists worldwide, including through yearly World Campaign and reports. Second, and it's been mentioned already in the panel, through standard setting and preventive work that currently supports around 50 member states in improving their legislative framework. And I hope that we will soon be able to work along with Sudan. It will be really a great honor as well for us. Third, training not only media professionals, but also judicial and security actors on freedom of expression. And fourth, through education and research, building on the whole of UNESCO's mandate, especially to improve critical thinking of young people thanks to media and information literacy. That being said, we have this UN plan of action, but we need to go further. We know that we need to go further. And this is only possible with the political and financial support of member states. And as Lord Ahmad said, we need the commitment of many. I wish to thank the UK and Canada for triggering with its fund the creation of a new instrument, which has been announced in July, the Global Media Defense Fund, which we will administer, and that aims to strengthen legal assistance for journalists in danger, thanks to a high-level independent legal panel. And I would like to give special recognition to Amal Clooney for her commitment and to the other members of the high legal panel that may be in the room today, I think, yes. The fund will also strengthen support to journalism through financial and normative actions. And more broadly, it will reinforce the existing mechanisms that have been supported by other member states, some of which are represented here today, and I want to thank them. We will sign today the agreement that will make this fund fully operational, and we will be able to launch the first call for projects in the framework of this fund, and we will be able to go forward and implement also a partnership with a high-level independent panel. I would like also to take this opportunity today with you to highlight two global awareness-raising events that are set to take place in the coming months. First, the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. As you know, it's always in November, beginning of November, for a sad anniversary, on the 2nd of November, and it will take place this year. The main launching will be in Mexico on the 7th. And second, the World Press Freedom Day Conference in the Netherlands from 22nd to 24th of April. As you know, last year it was celebrated in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and 2 years before, no one would have thought it would have been possible to celebrate Press Freedom Day in Ethiopia. And we had with us the pleasure to have, during this event, journalists that were formerly in prison, and that were with us in this transition, in this new Ethiopia. And I hope maybe we will celebrate in Khartoum the World Press Freedom Day as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Audrey. I'd now like to invite Jason to speak, and it's about time. We're here because of people like you. I think it's really important. I was with Jason yesterday. I've heard him speak about his story, and every time it's just incredibly moving. So I think it's important for us to hear what led to you being imprisoned for 544 days. Tell us about that, but also tell us what needs to change so that we can try to make sure that what happened to you doesn't keep happening to so many others.
Thank you so much. I want to first express my deep appreciation to the governments of the United Kingdom and Canada for putting these initiatives forward. A lot of progress in a short period of time, and it's incredibly important. I'd also like to applaud the Prime Minister for the progress that's happening in the Sudan, and that I'd like to ask you to push forward, even in the face of challenges, to reform in your country. It's worth it. As we sit here this morning, my jailers are in the building, and the jailers of many others who are currently in prison are in the building. And maybe some of you represent governments who have journalists currently in prison. Other governments who have murdered journalists in the last couple of years or over a period of several years are also in the building. And so I hope that if you have the opportunity to share these insights with your colleagues from your home countries or neighboring countries or others who you interact with this week, take that opportunity to do so, because this is fundamentally important to democracy and the future of free flow of information around the world. I want to echo everything that the rest of the panelists have said, but do it from an experiential point of view. In July of 2014, my wife and I were working as journalists in Iran. At the time, we represented 40%, the two of us, of the English language international media. So that gives you a sense of how open the media space in Iran was. It's even more closed now. On the evening of July 22nd, after returning from a session of negotiations over the JCPOA in Vienna, I was preparing, my wife and I were preparing to go to a surprise birthday party for my mother-in-law, when we were dealt a huge surprise. As we left our home, entered the elevator of our high-rise apartment building, armed security forces, plainclothes security forces, abducted us at gunpoint, ransacked our home, and took us to Evin prison, which some of you may have heard of. It's a notorious prison in Iran that houses political prisoners and has for several decades. We had no idea why we were being taken, how long this ordeal would last, and what the conditions, if we were to be released, would entail. We were thrown into solitary confinement. For the first 35 days, my wife and I had no contact with each other, no news of each other's fate. And during those 35 days and beyond, we were subjected to relentless interrogations. I was accused of being the CIA station chief in Iran, and she was accused of being my wife, which turned out to be true. During that period, my privacy, our good name in a country where we worked very hard to create one, were sullied. We were the subject of an extreme state-run propaganda campaign that persists until now. In the month of July of this year, Iranian state television broadcast a 30-part television series supposedly based on my crimes. It's a shocking representation of how authoritarian governments use propaganda in new and disgusting ways. It's been written about extensively in the American and international press. I don't encourage you to watch the show. It's not very good. But it's had the chilling effect of making it more difficult for journalists who are currently working in Iran to do their jobs. Ultimately, I spent 49 days in solitary confinement. My wife spent 72. She was conditionally released on to house arrest and stuck in her parents' home until an undetermined date. During the 49 days that I was in solitary confinement, I can say now that I was being starved. I lost nearly 20 kilos in those 7 weeks. And, I think some would say that I could stand to lose that weight again, and I agree. But, I don't encourage it as a path to weight loss. I was ultimately put on trial in what is called Iran's Revolutionary Court. If you find yourself in a trial with a court that has a revolutionary in its name, I don't think I need to tell you, you don't have a chance of winning. I did not win. I was accused of all sorts of security charges, national security charges against the Islamic Republic. And ultimately, in January of 2016, I was released. What I didn't realize at that point, that relatively we were lucky. In the last couple of years since my release, we've seen, as was mentioned earlier, a rise in the murder of journalists around the world, but most shockingly and disturbingly and worryingly for all of us should be the number of journalists murdered in democracies. In the EU, in Slovakia, and in Malta, we've had journalists murdered. In Malta, Daphne was murdered over 2 years ago. Jan Kuciak and his fiancée were murdered in Slovakia more than a year and a half ago. There's been no justice in these cases. In India, the world's largest democracy, a country that has more newspaper readers every day than the United States has citizens, we don't even know how many journalists have been murdered simply for doing their job, for bringing the truth to light, whatever that truth is. And you know, I'm shocked to say that I was at work in the May of last year when I got the news that 30 miles away in Annapolis, Maryland, 5 journalists were murdered at a local newspaper. So this is not something that is a problem of faraway dictatorships. It's not a problem that touches one continent or region of the world. It's one that has a connective tissue running through the entire global community at this point. And that connectivity is a desire by governments to suppress information and, whether they know it or not, work against democratic ideals. I think that there's been a clear similarity in the lack of due process in most cases of journalists being imprisoned around the world, put on trial. And increasingly, they are put on trial with charges of crimes of national security. I know what that means. It means that a journalist had something to say that the powers that be found unacceptable for the rest of the community to know. Invariably, those charges do not hold up under the light of day. They wither. And I implore all governments to do a better job of adhering to the rule of law, providing due process. If you don't, your democracy is a farce. Since coming back to work in early 2018 at the Washington Post, I was a reporter whose beat had been a very specific one. I covered Iran for the paper of record of the U.S. Capitol. It doesn't look like I'm going back to Iran anytime soon. But while I continue to write about it, there are other issues that occupy my mind and my concern. And increasingly, it has been to report on these violations of press freedoms around the world. And frankly, a lot of countries don't necessarily believe in the idea of free expression. But the ones that do have a right, a responsibility, a deep responsibility, to not only adhere to their own laws, but uphold them and amplify them for the rest of the world. If we can't do that in the UK and Canada and the United States of America, how can we expect Sudan to want to be like that? That's a question that I have for everybody here today. Ultimately, this point was driven home to me last year. All of us who work in journalism, who believe in free expression, no matter what political views we have, no matter what country we come from, no matter what religion, race, orientation we belong to, we have to support each other's rights to free expression. I never understood that more clearly than in a conversation I had with my late colleague and almost friend, Jamal Khashoggi. We were just getting to know each other. We wrote for the same section of the Washington Post. The global opinion section is not a large group of people, And Jamal and I had the opportunity to sit down and discuss life and experience for him in Saudi Arabia, for me in Iran. And it was very different. And his take on Iran was very critical. My take on Saudi Arabia, I don't mind telling you, is a very critical one. But we found common ground in the notion that people around the world, for us particularly in the Middle East, the right to free flow of information and expression is really the key to a better future. And I hope, if anything, that's what you remember today in your conversations with colleagues. Thank you very much.
Jason, thank you so much for your very moving remarks. I think you were obviously incredibly courageous to get through this, but also, and you said, as you said, you were one of the luckier ones, but you haven't just walked away thinking, well, phew, I'm now okay. You've actually spent a tremendous amount of time and energy on the cause of press freedom since you've been released, and I know you've made it a focus of your reporting as well. I know your wife has now become a full-time member of the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, so I think that's a great service to your fellow journalists. I've seen it with others as well. I represented a journalist who was detained in Egypt, and he was ultimately released. And then when I later came to represent two Reuters journalists who were detained in Myanmar, at one stage when they were still in prison, there was a protest outside the Myanmar embassy in London. And as I looked into the crowd, I could see the loudest person was Mohammed Fahmy, my former client, who'd been imprisoned in Egypt. So I think, thank you for all of the work that you're doing and others in similarly situated are doing to move this cause forward. I'm going to make some brief remarks and then we'll move to the question and answer segment. As you've heard from the other panel members already today, abuses of media freedom around the world are stifling speech and shredding the very fabric of democracies. No state is perfect and no region is untouched. But if democracy, as we know it, is to stand a chance of survival, we need leaders who believe in liberal values to step up. Many of you may have read the op-ed published earlier this week by the publisher of the New York Times. In it, he said that, quote, over the last few years, a growing number of governments have engaged in overt, sometimes violent efforts to discredit their work and intimidate them into silence. This is a worldwide assault on journalists, an assault on the public's right to know, on core democratic values, and on the concept of truth itself. A parliamentary committee in the United Kingdom foreshadowed this grim conclusion in a report issued earlier this month, which concluded that, quote, an unfree media is spreading from countries that are leading by bad example. It is time to turn things around. In my legal practice, I have defended journalists in many different jurisdictions, and my foundation has a program, Trial Watch, that monitors their trials worldwide. It is clear to me that although more than 170 states have signed up to the international treaty in which they promise to protect free expression, the international system that is supposed to enforce this promise is broken. We know this because record numbers of journalists are being abused across the world through vilification, threats, surveillance, imprisonment, even murder. And because all too often the abusers are governments themselves. But what exactly are the international rules in this area, and how can we give their enforcement some teeth? This is the question that the high-level panel of legal experts established as part of the campaign launched by the UK and Canada will be dealing with over the coming year. Since the panel, which is chaired by former UK Supreme Court President Lord Neuberger, was convened 2 months ago, we have teamed up with leading academic institutions from around the world to produce model laws. In other words, advice to states on the free speech guarantees that must be respected under international law. Our research targets laws being used every day to punish journalists for their work, laws like criminal libel, vague or overbroad hate speech laws, so-called fake news laws, and laws that muzzle the media by imposing arbitrary conditions on ownership, accreditation, and funding. As we heard, this is the case in Sudan, among many other places. Such laws are part of a rising drumbeat of legal assault on journalists, and they are particularly open to abuse when senior officials vilify the media, creating a toxic environment in which individual journalists are incredibly vulnerable to attack. Let me provide an example of a case that illustrates this all too well. The case of my client, Maria Ressa. Some of you will know her, and she's sitting there. When you see her, you'll see that she's a Filipino journalist who stands at 5'2", but she stands taller than so many of us in her courage and personal sacrifice to the cause of telling the truth. Maria Maria, as some of you know, was CNN's bureau chief in Jakarta and in Manila before she set up her own online news portal. And, like any journalist worth their salt in the Philippines, she has criticized the practices of the ruling regime in her countries and the murderous campaigns and subversions of the democratic order that are taking place there. The authorities have responded to this single reporter with the full weight of the state. They are pursuing her in more than 10 separate proceedings that seek to criminalize alleged foreign ownership in her company's stocks, dredge up spurious accusations about old tax returns, and directly target her reporting through libel suits. The president, who has called journalists prostitutes and warned that they are, quote, not exempted from assassination, has vilified Maria's news site in his State of the Union address to the nation. Her reporters have been banned from covering presidential events, and the president helped to amplify online attacks against Maria that at one stage reached a rate of 90 hate messages per hour. The message is clear. It is open season on journalists, and if you want to avoid such treatment, you know what you need to do. Now, Maria has a team of lawyers who can help her expose the abuse of the law and the violation of international treaties involved in this campaign to silence her. And there is still some hope that her case could be resolved. But if her government ultimately fails her, what system is there to help? When I spoke at the UK Media Freedom Conference in July, I said that 5 new international tools would help. Targeted sanctions regimes to impose serious financial consequences on state officials who abuse media freedom. Enhanced consular assistance to journalists who are detained abroad. The deployment of an international team to investigate attacks on journalists when the state authorities are unwilling or unable to act. A commitment to increased transparency so that we know when a journalist is arrested and we can get into courtrooms where they are being put on trial. And a system of visas for persecuted journalists who need to seek safety abroad. The panel is producing advice on each of these tools, and I'm pleased to report that since July, we have been engaging with the UK government on the plan to use a new statutory instrument on sanctions, a regime that will allow the UK government to bar human rights abusers from entering the country, to freeze their bank accounts and seize other assets. When I met Foreign Secretary Raab earlier this month, he expressed support for the use of such sanctions to protect the media. And I'm encouraged by the Foreign Secretary's statement earlier this week that the new system of targeted sanctions will, quote, provide a layer of UK accountability against those who target journalists with impunity in their countries. And Lord Ahmed repeated this firm commitment quite clearly a few minutes ago. Targeted human rights sanctions have actually rarely been used to protect individual journalists under threat. Neither the EU nor the UK imposed them in the wake of the chilling murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And even systems with developed so-called Magnitsky regimes have been slow to apply them in situations involving the arbitrary detention of a journalist or systematic attacks on the media. So this is an important opportunity to lead with a new paradigm. That when the media is attacked, targeted sanctions will be a counterattack. I hope that the work of the legal panel and more broadly the campaign will ultimately assist those states that are truly willing to promote free expression and expose those that are not. I hope we can help to switch the default from impunity to accountability, and that we will witness the consistent use of targeted sanctions when journalists are persecuted or killed. I hope that we can begin to shine a light on what is happening in the dark, so that sunlight can play its role as disinfectant. When Maria was arrested at her office in Manila, the police officer who handcuffed her whispered into the ear of one of her colleagues, "Be silent, or you're next." I would bet that her colleague will not be silent, and it's our job to make sure that she's not next. Thank you. Thank you. We are going to move to the question and answer segment. I think we have just about half an hour to go, so we're on time. I believe the Prime Minister of Sudan may need to leave a few minutes early, so I'm going to ask for a couple of questions that are directed specifically to the Prime Minister first, and then we'll move to questions directed to the panel as a whole. And can I ask that you introduce yourselves when I call on you, in case we don't know who you are, and say your affiliation as well, please. Yes.
Hello, I'm Mark Nelson from the Center for International Media Assistance at the National Endowment for Democracy.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure the mic is on just yet.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Perfect.
My name is Mark Nelson. I'm the director of the Center for International Media Assistance at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington. I have a question for the Prime Minister. Do you feel like you're getting the kind of support you need for the legal reforms and changes that your country needs to make? One of the things that we noticed in looking at the support for media development across the world is that international donors who put together $147 billion a year for development only give about 0.3% of that for media development. So out of that $147 billion, there's only about $500 million going to the changes that countries like yours need to make. Do you think we're doing enough, and do you think we can get more of the funding that goes to development to be dedicated to media issues and to media reforms that are needed in countries like yours?
Thank you. Do you want to go ahead and answer? Are there any other, can we collect any other questions specifically directed to the Prime Minister and then give him a chance to respond? Yes.
Hello, sorry. My name is Jamie Angus. I'm the director of the BBC World Service Group. And I just welcomed what the Prime Minister said about reinforcing broadcasting rights in Sudan. And Sudan have entered into dialogue about restoring the BBC World Service's FM broadcasts in the country, which have been missing for a number of years. And I just wanted to welcome that and ask the Prime Minister to confirm his commitment to continuing to expand the rights of trusted international broadcasters, including the BBC, to operate in Sudan, not least for the benefit of the Sudanese population, but also because it makes his country a beacon for so many other countries in the region, and that we would continue to support that. Thank you.
Prime Minister, could I ask you to respond, please?
Thank you very much, and let me first apologize I won't be able to be with you for the entire period. You know, this General Assembly is full of bilaterals, commitments, and meetings and all that. On the first question from Mark on the support for legal reform and particularly for the media part of it, you are absolutely right. There's very little resources going into supporting journalists and media freedom and all that. And I think if we are to get that media which is free and equipped and all that, we need to change this mentality and focus. Normally, aid assistance goes to formal structures, maybe the judiciary, others, which is very important, but to the complete neglect of the media, which is left to its own And the paradox is, in the current climate of cyber space, the electronic media and all that, journalism as we've known it is really under attack and seriously underfunded, under-resourced and all this. So I'm sure we need to work on this. And that can only happen through building an alliance. All of us, society, public opinion at large in the West, to revisit the priorities of the aid business and how it works. So I think we need that orientation, and I think this campaign should take on board some of this agenda and put it firm in the work of the campaign, Amal. On the issue, Jeremy from the BBC, yes, I can assure you, BBC, of course, you know, it's back. I grew up in Sudan in the 60s and the 70s, where the BBC radio was probably the only source of international information for people. And the paradox, years after that, BBC was prohibited from broadcasting from Sudan, and people were not having access to that. Today we restored it. But more than that, another news on this, we have also restored the Radio Monte Carlo, which was also banned from Sudan for so many years. So we are very determined to create an environment that is open and allow journalists unfettered access to information, but also to reporting anywhere. This is actually, we are not giving them any kind of privilege. It is good for our people. Free society, free people can only be productive, can be useful in their own life, but also for society. So I'm doing it precisely because of that. Even another one, I'm sure you know that Al Jazeera was banned for a short period. They are back now. So this is something that we feel very strongly about, and we will definitely uphold this. But Amal, if I may just make one or two remarks as a conclusion, then I can leave you. I think from what I heard and from what we lived through, we know that democracy worldwide is under attack. And it is up to us to defend it. But we know so well the beauty of democracy has the ability of correcting itself. With whatever challenges, and maybe it can get messy, and I'm not seeing that Sudan will suddenly, because of this change, will rise and become a full-fledged democracy the following day. It's a messy process, but we are prepared to go through it, because it is the only way that assures ourselves and our people that this is the way we can have a society that at ease with itself and peaceful and all that. I think we know also democracy is an unfinished business. There is no finished model that you could just import it. I wish there is one. You just take it out of a paper and then unfold it. Societies has to rise and fall in this process, and we are happy to take that journey with all its challenges and problems. We wish and we hope, and I'm sure our friends and partners could help us with this. Not only resources, but also sharing of experiences, just an experience, and how this thing can be inspiring. Training of young journalists and seeing the beauty of working in an open environment. But to conclude, I would just like to reiterate my earlier opening remarks that in a new Sudan, never again we will jail journalists. Thank you so much, and wish to see you in Sudan. Come and report from our society there, our failures and our successes. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I understand the Ghanaian Minister of Information is here and would like to say something before he has to go. Is that right? Oh.
Yes or no? Is that
Yes?
yes or
You have the right to free speech, but it has to be prompt. Minister, you have the floor.
Can I get some help with this mic? It's working now. Thank you. First, once again, we would like to congratulate the global community under the auspices of the UK and Canada that has put this platform together. For Ghana, essentially, we just want to give an update on what we've been doing so far since we met in summer. It goes without saying that Ghana's position as a rising star on the African continent is very well supported by the fact that we have a very robust, free media environment that operates in Ghana. We have done three major things in furtherance of that and also in support of this exercise that we undertook since summer. The first is to move into full implementation of our right to information law that we have now passed and the President has assented to in Ghana. Ghana's constitution under Article 21(1)(f) guarantees right to information, but we've never had legislation that actually spells out timelines and how to access that. And in the last set of months, Ghana has passed a Right to Information Act that now spells out clearly how anybody can access information from public offices in Ghana. That legislation had been on the table for about 20 years, and we're excited that we have passed it, and my ministry is responsible for implementing it in full. And we want to encourage the global community to perhaps, in countries where this is not already operational, join us because it has real dividends out there. The second is that Ghana has also completed our national action plan for the promotion of the safety of journalists. And the beautiful thing about that is that we did it together with all stakeholders, including journalists, security agencies, stakeholders, and of course the UK and Canadian governments' representatives that were in Ghana. And it's a plan that is owned by all stakeholders because literally everybody was around the table to put it together. And we expect to commence full implementation of that from November as we commemorate that day. In addition to that, and it is one of the things that we spoke about in the UK, that we need to also invest heavily in building the capacity of journalists and not always just wait for journalists to get into trouble before we want to come to their rescue. There must be a continuous exercise to invest in the building of the capacity of journalists. And so again, working with stakeholders in Ghana, we have completed work on what we call the Media Capacity Enhancement Program, where media owners, media practitioners, media actors have been around the table to spell out for themselves what they think the gaps are in the practice and the opportunities are. And what we are doing as an administration is to support by encouraging private sector to fund those capacity enhancement avenues so that, yes, while we defend media freedom, we also invest in enhancing capacity for the excellence in that space. And so for us in Ghana, we think that these are things we can share with a global platform and encourage other countries that are around the table to also follow suit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, can I ask you, and then Joel Simon from CPJ, please. Can I apologise in advance? The perils of selecting a chair who is not a member of the government may mean that I don't follow all the rules of protocol in terms of the order, because I'm not sure who everyone is, but I hope we'll manage to get everyone's questions in. Yes.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Milica Pešić, Media Diversity Institute, London. It's a pity that actually Prime Minister of Sudan left, because I think there are lessons from the Western Balkans which I would like to mention, which could be useful maybe for Sudan. There was a big event with the same topic in Podgorica in Montenegro a week ago, and we can see 25 years after the war, the problems with the media freedom are still the same. And my colleagues there call it stabilitocracy. The international community, media development supporters, they left too prematurely after the war. What's been happening, I'll give just one example. Small newspaper in Montenegro, small country of 670,000 people. VST has has 1/6 of the citizens of Montenegro visiting their platform every day. This is the most reliable source of information according to all polls there. They are struggling, even though they followed all the instructions of organizations such as SEMA, get profitable, build a trust, go for advertising business model. They're struggling. The biggest problem is political leaders who are calling them rats, who are accusing them for being mafia, constantly taking court cases against them, giving advertising only to the media close to the government. And if your sanctions are going to tackle this, it's who is getting advertising in Serbia, in Montenegro, and the governments are so skillful in doing that. Taking court cases against independent media constantly. It costs money and time, this media, such as Little VST. So I really appreciate if you push these countries. This is a good example. And a question for Lord Ahmed. There is a story in Western Balkans that British government has changed the priorities and that some media development contracts in the Balkans has been terminated. Is this true?
Lord Ahmed.
Well, I'd say I look into the specifics. I mean, there is also one adage I employ in life. You shouldn't read everything as truth, which you read in the media. But our relationship with different agencies around the world is very strong. I think one point I would make just on governments, we must engage with those governments, even the most challenging environments around the world. Because if we're going to see effective change, that means direct engagement. And I certainly subscribe to that philosophy.
Thank you. We're going to hear from Joel, and then I'd like to invite the Foreign Minister of Estonia. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This is a question, actually, and it's a follow-up question for Lord Ahmed. It's wonderful to see the UK and Canada take leadership with this initiative. It was inspiring to hear the words of the Prime Minister of Sudan. But I wanted to follow up on something that Jason said, which is that many press freedom violators, governments around the world that imprison journalists, governments around the world that are indifferent to violence and to murder committed against journalists are present during the General Assembly. And I wanted to know, as important as plans of action are important, declarations and principles are important, but I would like to know specifically what meetings the UK delegation has had or what concerns specifically the UK delegation has raised with countries that are violating press freedom, and to the extent that you could share with us what responses you have received.
Well, first of all, just going back to my previous answer, we do this. I alluded in my comments that I'm the Minister for Human Rights, both in terms of media freedoms and other human rights. We do engage directly. We've done so, and I listened very carefully, I think, to the comments that were made by Jason. And he's right. There are people present in this very building. That's a very sort of poignant reminder to us about the job we have ahead of us. And we do. I can assure you, I'm not going to go into specific details, but I can assure you my program, which has got immeasurably greater over the last 24 hours in terms of my interactions on a bilateral basis, do focus specifically on the issue of human rights. Very recently, only last week, I returned from Saudi Arabia, where I assure you one particular case, as well as broader issues of media freedom, were raised quite directly. There are times we do it in a public forum. There are other times we do it bilaterally. And I, for one, 2.5 years into this role, believe it does deliver, and we've seen the results of our effective advocacy and diplomacy in producing direct results. The other thing I'd allude to in terms of those who are perpetrators of these crimes, Amal's alluded to it, and I think one of the directions we've taken, and Dominic, Raab has been very clear on this, that we're already initiating now procedures, including the sanctions regime, which will specifically target individuals from entering the United Kingdom because of human rights violations, including those who persecute journalists in their respective countries. And that is evolving, and we look forward to taking that legislation through at the earliest stage we can.
Yes, the Foreign Minister of Estonia.
Thank you, Deputy Foreign Minister this time. The Foreign Minister was here earlier. He had to leave a little bit earlier.
At least I promoted and not doing
Yeah, thank you very much for promoting me. Well, many thanks for the UK government and also for hosting this meeting, and for Canada also as co-initiator of the coalition, and you, Ms. Amal Clooney, for your leadership in this field. We are glad in Estonia and honored to join the coalition, and we fully support the global pledge on media freedom. We also appreciate the multi-stakeholder format of this event. We are appalled by the persistently high number of killings of journalists around the world. We feel strongly that the struggle against impunity for the killers is essential to preserve the right to freedom of expression. We support the UN work being done by UNESCO, Human Rights Council, and General Assembly, as well as the Security Council. Estonia ranks 11th in the World Press Freedom Index and shares the first place on internet freedom with Iceland. We would like to offer our knowledge and best practices to the coalition and contribute fully to the work. For a number of years, we have stressed the importance of internet freedom. We remain committed to freedom online. And my question is, I would be particularly interested in your perspective on the possible areas of the coalition members on freedom of the media online. Thank you.
I know we have a number of people who have questions. I'm going to do a round of questions and then get some answers because we're running out of time, unfortunately. So we have Keelan Gallagher, Human Rights Barrister here, Christophe Deloire, Agnes Calamar, and... Sorry. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Montenegro, if we do that round, and then we'll do a second round. So please go ahead, Keelan, if you'd like to begin.
Hello? Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thanks very much, Amal. I act for a number of bereaved families whose loved ones are journalists who have been killed for their work. And I'm very grateful to the panel for mentioning a number of those cases, mentioning Daphne Caruana Galizia, Jan Kuciak and his fiancée Martina Kuznarova, amongst others. And I'm particularly grateful to Lord Ahmed for mentioning the case of Christopher Allen, the 26-year-old freelancer who was killed in South Sudan 2 years ago in August 2017. And I've just got a question about that case. And as Lord Ahmed knows, that's a case which has not got very much attention, in part because he was a freelancer, and he therefore hasn't had the same profile that some other cases have had. But just in terms of concrete actions, following on from Joel's question, the family has made 2 requests in relation to that case which are outstanding. And I would ask for a public commitment from those on the panel who feel able to do so, that they support those requests. The first is in relation to a criminal investigation. Lord Ahmed has referred to the investigative void 2 years on, in circumstances where Christopher was killed, in circumstances where there's a reasonable suspicion that there were war crimes committed. There has been no criminal investigation whatsoever in South Sudan or by any other body. And the family has asked the FBI to agree to investigate. As he was a US national, there are suspected war crimes, and the FBI was involved in repatriating his body. Regrettably, the deadline for a response from the FBI has been and gone. And I would ask anyone in the room who has bilateral influence on the US to ask them to give a response to the family promptly. We appreciate the FBI is an independent decision-making body, but they can be asked to give a respectful and speedy answer to the family, and we would ask for a commitment to that. But secondly, the United Nations itself has been asked to investigate its own failures in the aftermath of the death, when it was faced with the body of a journalist who'd been brutally killed, where there were clear questions raised right from the outset about war crimes. The UN itself has been asked to investigate, and again, we don't have an answer to that. So if the panel feels able, I'd be very grateful for support for those 2 specific requests, so that the principal point which Lord Ahmed made, supporting the family, is converted into concrete action. Thank you.
Thank you. Agnès Calamar, UN Special Rapporteur.
Thank you very much, Amal. I am the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, and I conducted the investigation into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I have two comments/questions to make. The first is actually a follow-up on many of the comments that have been made already about the large accountability deficits that we have identified through various cases. I have certainly discovered as I was conducting my investigation into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi that the United Nations had no meaningful role to play, seemingly, or had failed to act in a meaningful fashion. I recommended in my report that the UN establish a standing instrument for investigation into targeted killings, including into targeted killings of journalists, either in support of actors on the ground, national actors who are willing to undertake investigation, or instead of those national actors when they fail to do so, building on the model of the IIIM for Syria and Myanmar. I have met a lot of resistance to this proposal. I would like to suggest to the panelists that for the UN to be meaningful in the debate that we are discussing, we need to move into the area of accountability and investigation, and that instrument that I am proposing is key to realizing this objective. The second point I would like to make is with regard to speaking up. I think acting up, of course, is super important. I think speaking in that context is very important. I want to follow up, however, on what Joel has said. Immediately after my report, there was a G20 in Osaka, and there was that photo. I think you all know which photo I have in mind. The US president embracing Mohammed bin Salman and the rest of the G20 leaders waving at the camera. Previously, we had several public speech by leaders at the G20 disparaging press freedom. Now, I understand the purpose of those meetings is economic, is diplomatic, is strategic. But when there are leaders that are instrumentalizing those meetings to push these values that are contradicting what most of the people here stand for, and many of the leaders in that G20, I hope, stand for, it is their duty to speak up against that instrumentalization. I am not suggesting that they should stop diplomatic relations. I am just asking them to stand up or simply to walk out whenever there is such a display of a complete violation of the values the United Nations stand for. So I'm hoping that if the G20 moves to Riyadh, Amal will be able to hold a meeting of the G20 members that have all signed on to the charter, and that there will be conversation on press freedom. But I'm also hoping that that meeting will be held elsewhere. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnès. Can I, so that we can actually get time for some answers, could I just ask for really brief remarks, and if you could go straight to a question if you have one. I think there was, yes, Christophe, and then the Minister. I think if you use the handheld microphone, that would help. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Veljko Milanic from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Montenegro, in charge with the multilateral affairs. Since my country was mentioned here, I just want to say that we need to have really deep understanding of every and each issue that is going on in different settings, such as Montenegro. It is true we are the smallest, one of the smallest countries in Europe, 650,000 people, but we have almost 150 media outlets, which makes us the per capita, if we count one of the currently the most number of registered media per capita. I'm very acquainted with the situation in VST, And it is good that we have an open conversation, and that last week we had a conference in Podgorica talking about the issues that the media have with the state and vice versa, regarding the calling names and different situations which are very often seen, not only in the Balkans, but all over the place. But I think that it is very important that we keep the communication, we keep the conversation alive. We are very eager, especially since Montenegro is the furthest country in the Balkans that is going on with the European Union membership negotiation. And we are committed to build a legislative framework which we are checking with the European institutions on a monthly basis, creating a transparent models. And that's why we use the opportunity to be on every conference such as this, such as back in July in London, and to participate in the platforms that can support not only Montenegro, but to have a positive spillover to all other Balkan states. So not to mention that the government is trying to understand the issues that the media are facing with, especially in the times of economic crisis, which we supported. For our standards, it's a lot of money. It's almost €7 million in the past 10 years supporting media. So I just want to stop here, but I would like to continue conversation and regarding this issue if the lady wants it. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Christoph, please try to be really brief because Lord Ahmed has had a lot of good questions and we literally have 2 minutes left. I'm conscious we haven't had many questions from journalists, so if there's a journalist who wants to get in with the last question, and then the Deputy Foreign Minister of Canada, please. And I think that will have to conclude the questions, and I'd like Lord Ahmed and other panel members to make concluding remarks. Christoph.
You address
no need to shorten
UNESCO.
That part.
Sorry? This is the part I will really shorten. No. And I have 4 points. And this is like recommendations toward the members of the coalition that you've built. The first one is that be part of this coalition is a strong statement. We believe and expect that this will also be a strong commitment, not only a statement, a commitment. That's to say that you will take this occasion to, as Lord Ahmad said, that laws will be held at the highest standards in the countries of the coalition. And so we think that it should have an impact on the ranking of the countries in the World Press Freedom Index, and that this index could be a way to measure the progress by countries that are part of the coalition. The second point is that we are in the UN, and a lot of resolutions were adopted on the protection of journalists by various UN bodies, but there is no concrete implementation mechanism. And we do believe that one of the deliverables of the coalition could be to get such a mechanism to be created, and it should be the creation of a position of special representative to the UN Secretary-General on the protection of journalists, and that work can be done with a group of friends that has been built in New York City about this. Third point, we as an organization decided to directly engage with Saudi Arabia also, because after the killing of Khashoggi, and we want to get the truth, and the work of Agnès Calamard is really important, but there are 30 journalists at least who are arbitrarily detained in this country. And we want, of course, to get a concrete result. And I think that we have to invent new ways to work towards such countries, between countries, members of the coalition, and the civil society, and through direct engagement sometimes, but not only, of course. And that I will not repeat what Agnès said about the G20, but I think that this is key.
Can I invite you to just please one more sentence, and we're not going to have time otherwise.
We should not forget that journalists play in a field which is also a digitalized field, and that nowadays the guys who create the norms of this field are private interests, heads of platforms, or dictators, and that we have to set up the rules. Otherwise, they will do this, and they currently do this. And this is very complementary with the Initiative on Information and Democracy, which will lead tomorrow to a signature of a partnership. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Christophe, and sorry to rush everyone. We've got the Deputy Foreign Minister of Canada who we'd like to invite to speak.
To the questions, and then I could just make a few comments, because I don't have a question.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
Just again, in the interest of time, first of all, Christophe, I agree with a lot of what you proposed, and I think this is part of this initiative about strengthening relationships. The point on the internet, it's an evolving space, and I think what we want to do as part of this coalition is strengthen how can we actually protect journalists. I think I'm very cognizant of the freelancing point as well. A lot of journalists in the internet space are freelancers, and we need the journalists, civil society, and governments to work as one on that. I think that's a priority we could set. You raised a specific point about Christopher Allen. I'm delighted that Robert Destro, who's the new Assistant Secretary of State, and I look forward to working with him on the broad issue of human rights. I'm sure he's made a note of the points you made on vis-a-vis the FBI. International mechanisms, I'm going to, when you've got a great lawyer sitting next to you, I think I will bow to her expertise on this particular issue. But I think just generally, in concluding, before we hand over to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, I just want to say this is really, we're at the beginning of the process. I think we've already heard from Amal the progress that has been made since the summer. I think there are a lot of areas that require work. It's not just about statements, it's actions. I think the Global Media Fund is a good example. We ourselves have been evolving our own approach on that. We have some pilot projects in different countries, both in Africa, across Asia, and in Europe. We need to strengthen those to see how we can roll those out. In terms of training journalists, we have things such as the Chevening Scholarships within the UK. We're announcing programs which are media-focused and orientated, and we need the journalist fraternity to work with governments to see how we can strengthen it. I'm minded by what Jeremy Hunt said when he launched this initiative. As a politician and those in public life, journalists are always your best friends. However, it's a duty of anyone who serves in a thriving democracy to stand up for their rights. And I think this process is demonstrating exactly that priority. Amal?
Thank you. I mean, I think it falls on me just to comment on the investigation point. And yes, I totally agree. There is a glaring gap in the international system of protection when it comes to simply being able to establish facts in a cross-section of situations that require a proper investigation. I think we all noted your heroic efforts in trying to manage a large-scale investigation with ridiculously few resources, frankly. And so I think, the panel has this very much on their list. It's one of the 5 sort of priority areas in terms of how to improve the enforcement mechanism. We look forward to working with you in developing a concrete plan and then, taking that to governments and seeing if we can get their support. With that, I would like to invite the Deputy Foreign Minister of Canada to make a concluding remark, and then I believe the UK and UNESCO are going to be signing the MOU on the establishment of the Legal Defence Fund. For me, this is, other than the legal panel, which we hope will be able to produce concrete advice that can then be acted on, I think the Legal Defence Fund is another sort of very robust pillar of this campaign where we really hope we'll be able to say in a year's time, thanks to this fund, X number of journalists now have had the ability to access legal advice, to get a particular type of protective equipment or training. And so this, to me, represents a positive beginning. Yes, Minister.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you, Mal and Lord Ahmed and the Media Freedom team for organizing this event, which has been terrific. With Canadian politicians currently engaged in an election campaign back home with vigorous media coverage, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, was unable to travel to New York this week, but I know that she would have really wanted to be here had she been here, and she sends her best wishes for this event. We've been working very closely, as has been noted, with the United Kingdom to propose new initiatives to strengthen media freedom, which included co-hosting the Media Freedom Conference in July, which I was fortunate enough to attend myself. And we were all inspired by the commitment and courage of journalists from around the world, as we were today by Jason's story. It's now incumbent upon those of us in this room to enact positive change. In calling for the creation of a new Media Freedom Coalition, our objective has been to provide a new tool for governments and stakeholders to advocate more effectively for media freedom. And Canada looks forward to working with the UK and others as the Media Freedom Coalition takes shape. And we look forward to the recommendations of the high-level panel. We will continue to remain actively engaged with other member states, international organizations, civil society, media organizations, journalists, and others to build on the outcomes of London and identify ways to continue to enhance this important work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are you doing this? I'm going to move out of the way. Okay. I'm going to move out of the way so that this mini signing ceremony can occur. Thank you so much to everyone for your presence and active participation.